Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Challenging Economic Assumptions. We're here to talk about economics. It's constantly being discussed by the media, by your dad, by your colleagues, throwing around ideas about what is good for the economy, what is bad for it, and how the hell we can make sure it continues to grow. Yet where have these ideas come from? In this series, we'll be unpacking some of the underlying ideas which underpin traditional economic thinking and discussing how we got here and what the impacts and repercussions of these assumptions have been on our societies and where we can go next. Our hosts, Gerry McCartney, Professor of Wellbeing Economics at Glasgow University, and Carmel Williams, Associate Professor from the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation, will be talking with various thinkers, activists, and economists who have focused their efforts on understanding these assumptions and how they have shaped the way we live. Today we'll hear from Mohsen Javdani, an Associate Professor of Economics at the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Emerging from the established route of Neoclassical economics, Mohsen's work now carries a critical eye on the Neoclassical thinking. His work focuses on challenging and understanding the mechanisms and processes which hinder equality and produce exclusion and marginalization. He has published some really interesting research on the ideological biases among economists, which will be discussed in today's episode. We hope you enjoy.
So, hi, and welcome to this edition of the Economics Assumptions podcast. I'm Gerry McCartney from the University of Glasgow. We are joined by...
I'm Carmel Williams from the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation, based in Adelaide, South Australia.
And
I'm Mohsen Javdani. I'm an Associate Professor of Economics in the School of Public Policy at Simon Fraser University in Canada.
Mohsen, thank you so much for making time to talk to us today. So I came across your work quite recently, but I understand you've had quite a journey into economics. Do you want to just talk us through how you've ended up in the role that you're currently in?
Sure. So I'm originally from Iran. I moved to Canada. It's been 20 years now. It's scary when you think about how fast time passes. I came to Canada to go to graduate school. So I did my master's and PhD here in economics. And then I started my academic journey as an assistant professor at UBC. And then several years later, I moved to the School of Public Policy at Simon Fraser University. I was primarily trained as what is referred to as a mainstream or neoclassical economist, and I will talk more about what that exactly means later on, because that's the dominant school of thought in economics. In Canada, as far as I understand, there are no economics departments where you can study any alternative views. So neoclassical economics is quite dominant in Canada. And in the United States, there are maybe 2 or 3 econ departments that have a non-mainstream or heterodox approach to economics. And given this ecosystem and lack of diversity, this was, of course, the only option to study economics. And I wasn't really exposed to various views of economics and how to study and understand economic outcomes. But, during my undergrad and even prior to that, I had some exposure to, philosophy and, sociology and psychology. So I had, interest in history as well. And when I started to study economics, gradually it sort of became apparent to me that the sort of narrative that is presented in econ departments is quite monolithic and insular from other social sciences. You get a very monolithic discourse and a way of thinking about the society and the economic outcomes, which is quite detached from historical context and from alternative pluralistic ways of thinking about the economy and the society. So slowly I started to become disillusioned, if you want, by mainstream economics and its all too neat packaging of how to understand economic and social phenomena. But of course, there are social structures and norms which are quite powerful and dominant within the discipline of economics, which really discourages people from thinking about other alternative views, and it sort of pushes people to towards conformity and group thinking. So when I started as an assistant professor, I was in an economics department. I was lucky that it was part of an interdisciplinary unit with philosophy and political science. So it gave me some flexibility in terms of the kind of research I wanted to do. But then later on, I decided to move to a more interdisciplinary department. That's why I'm in the School of Public Policy right now, because it gives me sort of the freedom and flexibility to examine issues that I'm interested in from a more pluralistic perspective, as opposed to the monolithic approach that economics, neoclassical economics, imposes on people who ask these questions.
Okay, so that's fascinating. So you've, if you like, started in a very sort of mainstream traditional economics approach, and you've moved across. And can you tell us a wee bit more about why you did that? Were there particular questions that you were unable to answer within that sort of mainstream neoclassical approach, or was there particular puzzles or particular, was there particular events, I guess, that prompted that?
I guess what happened was that I felt uncomfortable with the reductionist and sort of simplistic approach that neoclassical economics takes to understanding, economic outcomes and social problems. Because of my prior exposure to, more pluralistic approaches to understanding social problems and economic phenomena and outcomes. When I started to study economics, I felt that it is not really equipped, given the way it approaches problems, to dig deeper into some of the underlying mechanisms and structures that can help gain a deeper understanding of the subjects and the issues that we are studying. So I wasn't really happy and satisfied with the depth and the monolithic lack of depth, I should say, and the monolithic approach to understanding different problems. So my initial reaction to this was to try to focus my research and attention on topics that was of interest to me. A lot of my research has to do with understanding and challenging mechanisms and processes that give rise to inequity and marginalization and discrimination. So primarily, when I started working on my PhD thesis, I started to work on inequality in the labor market. But then increasingly so, I found the space to be quite limited. I was discouraged from pursuing more in-depth analysis of issues of discrimination. I was repeatedly told that, unless you can provide concrete, objective evidence of discrimination in the labor market, for example, experienced by women, you can't really discuss or even talk about discrimination in your thesis, because there are all sorts of different mechanisms that could give rise to, differences in, say, wages in the labor market between men and women.
So it sounds, what you're saying, Mohsen, is that actually economics, the mainstream traditional neoclassical economics, takes a really simplistic view of these complex societal challenges that we're facing, in particular, inequity and inequalities, and as you're talking about in the labour market. So that's something that I think people would be surprised to understand, and would find perhaps even to some extent a bit shocking that neoclassical economics isn't equipped to be able to respond to and understand the complexity of these societal phenomena. Is that how you're seeing it?
Absolutely. So I can elaborate a little bit more on that and provide some more context to this. Neoclassical economics, which, as I mentioned, is the dominant form of economic thinking today, emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century as a response to what was referred to as classical political economy. Classical political economy was primarily concerned with explaining the capitalist economy, drawing upon whatever historical and social factors were considered to be relevant. From Adam Smith, who is considered the father of modern economics, to John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, the economy was really treated as part of its wider social and historical milieu, with political economy as sort of a unified social science to cover this wide claim. This all changed with what is known as the marginalist revolution, out of which economics was established as a discipline, advocating for a more rigorous incorporation of mathematical frameworks and a focus on individual decision-making processes to understand how people allocate their limited resources to satisfy the unlimited wants. That's how economics is often defined within the dominant discourse. So the rise of neoclassical economics involved, I guess, one could talk about a triple reductionism, which remains characteristics of the discipline to the present day and is the reason behind this narrow focus that misses a lot of the nuances and complexities. The first part of that triple reductionism is the reductionism to the individual as the key analytical building block, and through which collective agents, notably classes, are replaced in extreme by representative individuals as the basic unit of analysis. And as a result of that, the economy becomes treated as if it is a simple consequence of the aggregation over its individual elements. Second, the economy is reduced in being treated as if it were confined to market supply and demand in the absence of consideration of other non-economic or social factors, as if market relations could prevail independently of the broader social context. There are economists like Wilfredo Pareto who introduced the concept of Pareto efficiency and helped develop the field of microeconomics, for whom economic became synonymous with rationality, defining the social as the residually non-rational. His own terms are actually logical and non-logical. And in this way, sociology occupied the territory not only of the non-rational, but also of the non-market. And the third element of this reductionism is that economic analysis is based on principles that have virtually no attachment to history other than in their application to a specific historical situations. And because of this dehistoricization, neoclassical economics has the tendency to universalize concepts, stripping them of their historical and social context. Let me give an example, perhaps, to clarify that. Imagine you work in a factory and you receive a wage for your labor. In mainstream economic theory, wages are often viewed as the price of labor. According to this abstract view, your wage is purely the result of market forces, the skills you offer, and the demand for those skills by employers. Now, this perspective treats wages as a neutral, universal concept that applies in the same way, regardless of historical or social context. This dehistoricized view misses, for example, things such as how wages are evolved due to changes in labor laws, economic policies, or social movements. And of course, understanding the historically specific context would help us see why wages are not just about supply and demand, but also about important factors such as power, policy, institutions, and social change that are often ignored or missed in mainstream economic analysis.
Yeah, and racism and imperial kind of processes going back centuries as well. In your context in the USA, in your context, Carmel, in Australia, and the British Empire being a notably horrible example of those historical processes that still generate power relations to this very day. So Mohsen, just to bring it forward to sort of the present day. So you talked about the rise of the neoclassical scholars that had that reductionist approach. To what degree do you think those neoclassical assumptions are still important in economic and broader policy making today in countries like Australia, the USA, and across Europe?
Um, you know, let me mention perhaps at the outset that these assumptions that neoclassical economics relies on, and these are things like rational behavior, perfect information, market equilibrium, prioritizing efficiency over distributional issues, and we can talk more about those later on. These assumptions can help develop theories and models that can offer some insights into certain economic behaviors and outcomes. However, in my view, they also come with significant and systematic limitations and blind spots. And the problem with that is that those systematic limitations and blind spots are becoming increasingly important to understand the challenges and the crises we are facing in our societies, right? So, there are various approaches that neoclassical economists would take to try to justify the validity of the assumptions. There is empirical testing, but that's an easy one to bend to a narrative because you only produce and publish work that validates your assumptions. There is theoretical consistency, trying to ensure that assumptions are internally consistent and logically coherent. But, for example, something like the rationality assumption is logically consistent within the framework of utility maximization, but that doesn't really mean much. There is practical utility of these assumptions, which relates to the predictive power or explanatory power of models. This is the sort of the instrumentalist view of science, that it's primarily focused on generating accurate predictions. And many economists would argue that, the assumptions often provide useful predictions and insights into market behavior, and many would disagree with that. We can talk more about those. The way I think about the validity of assumptions in economics is to ask, how well it represents the reality it is meant to model and understand, and how useful it is for the purpose of the analysis. And there is an important trade-off involved here that is important to think about. On the one hand, assumptions often simplify reality to make models tractable and allow us to focus on the specific issues of interest. I should mention, however, that given the exclusive reliance of economics on mathematical models, there are major self-imposed limitations introduced as a result of the degree to which you can incorporate complexities of the real world into mathematical models while keeping them still tractable. So assumptions, by definition, are supposed to simplify the complexities of the real world. So that's not a criticism of assumptions. But on the other hand, we need to assess, I think, the extent to which the loss of realism resulting from this simplification significantly affects the model's usefulness. If you think about the usefulness of assumptions that essentially take the social out of the economy, the economy is reduced in being treated to market supply and demand in the absence of consideration of other social factors. What this does is that it shifts the focus of analysis to the individual and also to a particular form of optimizing behavior. And the economy is therefore studied as a set of market relations, with broader social and political relations fading into the exogenously given background. And I would argue that the consequence is a misguided, ill-informed, and simplistic economic analysis that overlooks some very significant factors at play when trying to understand economic phenomena.
So that kind of partly would explain why we're really struggling as a global society to seriously address climate change and the way we think about the environment. There have been some experiences here in Australia where you know, development issues have considered the value of trees and green space one of my keen interest, and actually we've used economic models to help us determine and respond to kind of the political challenges of trying to balance development with maintaining the environment, you know, the urban environment in particular. And we found that some of the economic models have presented a tree that's a sapling, a 12-month-old tree, to be economically more valuable than a 30-year-old tree with huge canopy that provides habitat for biodiversity and shade, et cetera, and much better at, you know. So this is a sort of example of what it is that you're explaining now, Mohsen. Is that a good example?
That's absolutely correct, right? Because a lot of these issues, a lot of these important considerations, they become basically externalities in economic analysis. Yeah. But what happens is because of implicit normative decisions that are masked by this technical economic jargon, you know, externalities are everywhere in our social lives. But you know, economics really narrows them down to a limited set of issues, and because of that, a lot of the things that you just mentioned are going to be ignored and missed in economic analysis. Maybe if I can take a step back, you know, let's consider, for example, the notion of limited resources and unlimited wants, which is closely related to the environmental challenges we face. You know, sort of the way economists think about you know, economics, and again, you know, is sort of defined as the science of trying to allocate limited resources to unlimited wants. Now, if you think about this characterization, you know, economists basically maintain that while we must allow people to decide for themselves, what makes them happy is that, you know, they always want more. Unlimited wants does not mean that we want an unlimited amount of a specific thing. Rather, it means that there will always be something that we will desire. There will always be new desires, and our desires and wants are fundamentally unlimited. So based on this characterization, society therefore needs to use its resources as efficiently as possible to produce as much as possible, and society needs to expand what it can produce as quickly as possible. Hence, the emphasis that economics and economists put on goals such as efficiency and growth. There are economists who reject the assumption of a scarcity as a basic economic condition. Post-Keynesian school regards the economy to be generally running below full capacity. So the focus is the economy in deep recession, and they argue that it is difficult to maintain the idea of a scarcity when there is an army of unemployed workers wanting to work. This shapes their view of the economy being in abundance, in fact, and their main concern is rather how to employ all the idle labor and capital. The other economists, prominent among them Emily Northrop, who question whether unlimited wants, which are the fundamental cause of a scarcity, are really innate, and argue that they may be constructed through the power of social norms and power of advertising. They point out that the notion of unlimited wants puts all wants on an equal footing. And this goes back to your example. The equality of wants reflects the market value system that no goods are intrinsically more worthy than others, just as no preferences are more worthy than others. So it follows from this logic that one person's want for a subsistence diet is no more important than a billionaire's want for a precious jewelry. This is a clear value judgment, and one that many people would reject, yet economics which unquestioningly adopts this approach, claims to be an objective social science that avoids making value judgments. And the effect of taking a scarcity to be a fundamental state of nature leads to an unnecessarily harsh and competitive environment. And it is also noteworthy that people like John Maynard Keynes disagreed that all wants have equal merit. Rather than identify the economic problem with the scarcity, Keynes identified it with the satisfaction of what he called absolute needs: food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare. And this is becoming prominently what many scientists and environmental scientists are telling us, that we need to move towards a different kind of economic paradigm when we focus on satisfaction of these absolute needs, as opposed to this overconsumption by the wealthy of luxury goods, which are increasingly damaging the environment. And this definition of the economic problem, I would argue, puts equity and distribution of income front and center, which is in contrast with the textbook approach of treating equity as a political issue outside the scope of economic analysis.
So I find this fascinating, Mohsen, and not least because it poses different questions, I guess, of what the purpose of the economy is what we're trying to achieve through economic activity. But the reason I found your work actually was because I was interested in the empirical evidence that underpins a lot of the assumptions that go into the kind of models that governments run to allocate resources or make decisions about tax or public spending. And these economic models are very influential. But a lot of the evidence that underpins these assumptions we've been discovering through this podcast are less certain and less based on empirical evidence than one might be led to believe. But your work brings a whole different angle to that around, I guess, some of the potential biases that might have crept into that world. Could you maybe talk us through how or what question you asked first of all, and how you went about addressing it?
Sure. Maybe I should also explain how I became interested in asking this question. So basically, the question I was interested in the paper that you also referred to earlier is to try to examine the effect of ideological bias in views among economists.
Yeah.
And sort of the context to that is when I was a graduate student in economics, we were often told that economics adopts a positivist approach and is value-free, and economists are unbiased scientists who put all their biases aside, as if that's possible, and just deal with the data and the hard facts. But then through the socialization process and sort of talking to various people, economists in our own department, but also all the guest prominent economists who came from various departments, primarily from the States and in Canada. I was actually shocked by the extent to which a lot of these economists were extremely ideological, yet they were under the illusion that the analysis and the understanding of the world is completely value free. So this was quite shocking to me, because to me it was alarming, because I always thought that admitting that we are influenced by our biases and our worldviews and our ideologies is always significantly more healthy than being under the illusion that we are unbiased and everything to do is scientific in the positivist sense of the term. So because of that, I was interested in trying to explore how one can examine this influence of ideological bias based on the anecdotal experience and evidence that I had in a more systematic way on economists. And this is not a new topic. It's a long-standing debate in economics that talks about the influence of ideology in economics. In fact, one way you can read the history of economic thought is through this continuous attempt in economics to distance itself from the taint of ideology and sort of establish the discipline as a scientific discipline, comparing itself with physics and chemistry and biology, right? So some have argued that, views among mainstream economists, which are shaped by this dominant neoclassical discourse that I explained, are influenced by a strong yet obfuscated ideological underpinnings of the discourse. The challenging thing is that these ideological underpinnings are often masked by technical language, jargon, and methods, which most models in economics heavily rely on. So when you see the mathematical models and the statistical models on the Greek symbols, it gives you the impression that this is got to be, scientific. This makes these narratives look objective and ideology free, and masks normative choices as purely technical. It also makes it challenging for both outsiders as well as economics students as soon-to-be insiders to access and understand the ideological underpinnings of these models and narratives. And this lack of understanding and critical engagement with these ideological underpinnings and the epistemic limitations could result in ideological biases and blind spots, which paint a narrow and reductionist view of the world. So that was really the backdrop of my interest in examining this issue. I remember I was reading a paper, and the paper was talking about the importance of inequality in the social context. And there were two quotes, one from Adam Smith and one from Karl Marx, both of which were basically highlighting the same thing. And I remember I thought to myself, this is interesting. So I wonder, if I were to show these things, these statements to economists, and if they knew one comes from Marx and one comes from Smith, despite the fact that they both make the same argument, I wonder to what extent they would accept one and reject the other one. So that sort of brought to my mind idea of this experiment where I would put to economists a series of statements on various economic issues, and then ask them to evaluate these statements, to tell me to what extent they agree or disagree with these statements. And I embedded in that sort of survey a sort of treatment effect. And the treatment was that when people participated in the survey, at the very beginning of the survey, they would get randomly sorted into three different groups without them knowing. So one group, which I would call the control group, they saw all those 15 statements, and all those 15 statements were attributed to well-known mainstream economists. The treatment group, the first treatment group, would see the same statements, but all these statements were attributed to well-known, ideologically different, non-mainstream economists. And then there was a second treatment where there was no source attribution. They would just see the statements. And because of the randomization, this is called a controlled experiment, which is sort of the golden standard in economics to try to measure causality. Because of this randomization, I could simply look at the extent to which economists agree or disagree with different statements based on the source attribution, and whatever difference that would emerge would be basically the result of the difference in source attributions, because everything else on average was similar. And then what I found was that when sources were changed from a mainstream source to a non-mainstream source, the level of agreement with those statements significantly dropped. Now, one could argue that, that's to be expected. We are, of course, influenced by sources attributed to, different views and statements. So, but that's, of course, contrary to the positivist claims of neoclassical economics. But even if we grant that, one thing I did was, at the end of the survey, I asked economists a series of questions. And one question I asked them was, when you evaluate a statement, what do you take into consideration? And they had three options. One option was you only look at the content of the statement. You also, and the second option was that you only look at this attributed source and the views of the author, or a combination of the two. And prominent majority, about, I believe, 84% of economists claim that when they evaluate a statement, they only look at the content of the statement. They don't care about the views of the source behind it. And this was in sharp contrast, of course, with our findings that suggested that the source attribution and whether the source was mainstream or non-mainstream had a significant impact on the assessment and evaluation of these statements. And then we, of course, looked at differences by gender. For example, we found that female economists exhibited significantly less ideological bias compared to male economists. Another interesting thing we found was differences by political orientation. Another question I asked economists was to sort of self-identify on the spectrum from far left to far right. And something very interesting that emerged when we looked at differences in the effect of our treatment by political leaning and orientation was that those who identified as right or far right were significantly more likely to say they care more about the content of a statement. But in fact, their behavior was the exact opposite. They were, I think, 600 times more likely to react to changes in sources by lowering their agreement level compared to those economists who identified as far left or left, which again demonstrates how economists and their views and analysis are shaped by all sorts of different ideological underpinnings. It's not so much about the fact that we are influenced by these ideologies. It is more about the fact that economists have been pretending for such a long time that they are not influenced at all, and they are conducted the analysis in a way that is unbiased and value-free. So that is sort of one of the major findings. And it was also interesting how the discipline reacted to this paper. It was a very interesting and challenging journey to get the paper published. I sort of, in a way, I was curious to see. I kind of knew that I don't stand a chance to get this paper published in any major mainstream journal in economics, but nonetheless, I wanted to give it a try to see how right I was. So I started from the top 5 journals that are well known in economics and went down the list. I think I submitted to 13 or 14 journals in economics.
Wow.
And most of those, they did not even send the paper to referees. They just, desk rejected the paper. And there were, of course, all sorts of excuses offered. One prominent journal I remember said, sorry, but we don't publish papers about our own profession. And it's interesting that the same journal had published a paper a few years back called Economic Imperialism. And interestingly, it's not a paper about sort of criticizing the imperialistic approach of economics. It's actually a paper about glorifying and endorsing the fact that economics has spread its influence among other social sciences by being very imperialistic, because it sort of, in their view, suggests that economics is superior, and the fact that it has spread its influence among social sciences and it has sort of been able to influence the way other social sciences examine and understand other social phenomena is an evidence of that superiority, which is of course very interesting, which is a very interesting perspective.
And what are the implications of this? So you've described a series of assumptions that permeate the dominant economic discourse. You've described and indeed demonstrated and tested that there are a range of biases within the economics profession, and also, I guess, how how decisions or advice is generated within the economics discipline. So what does that mean for, I guess, policy and practice, and for how economic insights feed through into real life, consequences?
Um, I would argue that that the mainstream narratives in economics and the ideological foundations have made the discipline ill-equipped to engage in balanced and in-depth debates regarding these the controversial issues that characterize our times, right? So, if we take a look around, um, we sort of realize quickly, I would say, that there's something fundamentally wrong with our current political, economic, and social systems. We face unprecedented environmental degradation, which I would say is the result of the current economic systems often prioritizing efficiency and corporate profits over long-term sustainability and economic prosperity, which is not, by the way, necessarily the same as economic growth. We are facing, as the seminal work of economists like Thomas Piketty shows, we are facing rampant and obscene levels of income and wealth inequality, which also feeds into social inequality. We are facing political polarization and the rise of totalitarianism and radicalism around the world, crisis of representation within many democracies, systemic corruption in governance, public health crises, precarious employment, and challenges to the future of work, and the rise of artificial intelligence and its implications for the future of work, and what is referred to as surveillance capitalism. So, given this polarized economic, political, and social spheres, which are increasingly shaped and dominated by ideological forces that really paint slightly different pictures of the good society and of the chief means of constructing such a society and the critical challenges we face, the future of human societies, our individual autonomy, and our modern democracies are really being shaped by ideological battles on these critical issues. And what I would argue is that we need new narratives to be able to promote and implement structural changes that are badly required to meaningfully address and challenge to meaningfully address the challenges we face in our human societies. As report after report from reputable scientists and prominent international organizations suggests, business as usual is not an option. And I would argue that mainstream economics has been, over the last few decades, sort of has provided the intellectual, the cognitive infrastructure of neoliberal policies that have contributed to the crises that I just talked about. I think, as things currently stand, economics is no longer fit for purpose. I think we have to recognize that conventional economics and the social sciences more generally have not done well in helping us cope with a new world and its major issues. And I think a meaningful way to address these serious limitations, some of which we talked about, would require a profound paradigm shift in economics. I think it would involve embracing more pluralistic approaches that account for the complexity and richness of human behavior, including the influence of social norms, power dynamics, and institutional contexts. And within this, perspective, one can think of various different alternative or pluralistic approaches. There's, what is known as institutional economics, which emphasizes the role of institutions such as laws, norms, and organizations in shaping economic behavior. And this approach recognizes that economic outcomes are deeply influenced by the institutional context within which individuals operate. And it's actually very interesting. The type of institutional economics I mentioned is often referred to as the old institutional economics, which actually differs significantly from the approach practiced by neoclassical economists. Prominent among them is Darren Acemoglu, which is sometimes referred to as neo-institutional economics. And these differences are really illuminating and insightful, again, in trying to understand the challenges we face. They differ significantly in their methods, assumptions, and areas of focus. Old institutional economics offers a broader, historically grounded perspective that highlights power and conflict, which underlie a lot of the challenges we face today, while new institutional economics provides a more formalized, efficiency-oriented framework that sort of really integrates with neoclassical economics. And whenever it tries to examine the role of power or institutions, it's really an augmented version of neoclassical economics. And is, of course, limited by the tractability of mathematical assumptions and quantifiability of how you measure power and institutions and so on and so forth. So most of that exercise boils down to comparative analysis of looking at different countries with different institutions and see how that impacts various different outcomes. Yeah.
Mohsen, that has been a tour de force of, I guess, the history of economic thought and the development of different economic assumptions, but finishing up there with a sort of manifesto of what the economics profession and discipline needs to think about much more carefully to address this sort of polycrisis that you outlined. So thank you very, very much for your time today. But we're at the end of our time. So thank you again for participating in the podcast. Carmel, is there anything you'd like to add
I
before we
just wanted
finish?
to say it's really helpful for us to understand and to hear these diverse perspectives of economics, because in the field that Gerry and I work in, public health, very much focused on inequality and its consequences on health and well-being, and the frustration that we feel when trying to argue for policy changes that we know will be good for broader population and individual health and well-being. Economics often, dominant economic theories and arguments often get in the way of what we know would be really good public policy. So now I feel I have a much richer understanding about why that is, and perhaps even a few tools to be able to use to challenge some of those as we move forward. So thanks so much for your time, Mohsen. It's been really, really great pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And that's it for today's episode of Challenging Economic Assumptions. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and please share with anyone you think will be interested in this discussion. Thank you so much for listening.